Yeah, actually, I've had one of these before and didn't know. She may come back though. We'll see. I'll be interested if she gets sucked into the Western life. She may.
My understanding is that like the East Coast fisheries are so contentious and so challenging compared to like almost anywhere else. So it'll be interesting to see if she gets this like broader exposure.
Yeah, she very well may.
Started in like Florida.
She might just be assuming it's going to be the same. Yeah, it's really interesting to see because right now there's so many options in North Carolina. It is like many years down the road, postdoc after postdoc, right? But I'm not
Well,
counting.
good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Water Quality Committee. I'll begin by introducing General Statute 163A-159E, mandating that the chair inquire as to whether any member knows of any conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the Environmental Management Commission's Water Quality Committee. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of conflict, please state so at this time. So the record shows that no one has voiced any concern about their position on that. So we'll proceed. And let me just start by saying hello. In my new role, I am Marion Deerhake, and I was honored to be asked by Chairman Myberg to serve as the Water Quality Committee Chairman. So thank you, Chairman Myberg. Many of you have seen me at EMC meetings for a number of years in the past, and I've served as Air Quality Committee Chairman based on my experience supporting federal air quality standards development. However, some of you may not know that my graduate work was with water quality, wastewater disinfection in particular, and I've led a number of federal water quality and aquatic ecology projects with my contract work, particularly since 2007. In the past years, I've always made the effort to sit in on Water Quality Committee meetings chaired by Dr. Pete Peterson, which many of you have followed for years. And I served as hearing officer on the original TARPAM Ag rules and the first Falls Lake nutrient rules during my the tenure of EMC Chairman Dr. David Moreau, who chaired for many, many years. Upon returning to the EMC in 2017, I was fortunate to serve as Water Quality Committee Vice Chairman, thanks to past Chairman J.D. Solomon's appointment and past Water Quality Chairman Dr. Bob Rubin. All that being said, I welcome and I'm excited to have the opportunity to chair such an esteemed panel of EMC members. Our state's water quality has always been at the front and center as a key indicator of North Carolina's condition. It generates tremendous tourism, is an essential resource for our thriving community's health and industry success, and that is why our waters deserve the Commission's thoughtful, science-based management to protect it and in turn preserve and improve the quality of life that our growing population seeks. I look forward to working with each of you, both on the members in the panel as well as those in the audience, and I welcome the opportunity to learn more about the diverse interests in North Carolina water quality policies from the public and stakeholders. I'd also like to add that I've always held the manner in which the EMC conducted its meetings as a model or a standard for other boards and committees on which I've served. The respect of orderly discussion and other members' views is very important to me and to all of you, I'm sure. So please, as we discuss agenda items, please signal to me with your hand in some fashion whether or not you'd like to speak, and I will recognize you. And now I'd like to ask each of our Water Quality Committee members to identify themselves and, just for the interest of those in the audience, to tell us what river basin you live in. So I live in the Neuse River Basin. I was raised in the Yadkin. So our next member would be, I will go to Vice Chairman Harris, and I've asked her if she would serve as our Vice Chairman, and she's kindly agreed to do that.
All right, thank you. Excuse me. And I too am honored to serve in this position and will do my best. And I look forward to working with this group. I currently live in the Roanoke, but grew up in the Tar-Pam Basin.
Okay, good. Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Well, I grew up in the Yadkin Basin over by High Rock Lake, and I'm now in the Neuse Basin.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Davis?
I live in the Yadkin PD River Basin, right where the basin changes from the Yadkin to the PD River. And I spend an extensive amount of time working in the Catawba River Basin as well.
Good. Mr. Gillespie?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mitch Gillespie. I live in the upper Catawba Basin, as we like to call it up there. There's a lower and an upper, and we identify that as the state. And I served 14 years on the Bi-State Commission also, Catawba Bi-State Commission, and got to sit through a Supreme Court lawsuit dealing with the IBTs back in the day that went all the way to a 3-judge panel on the Supreme Court who ruled against the IBT as submitted. So that was some interesting years.
I'm sure. Thank you. Mr. McAdams?
Thank you. I grew up in the Neuse River Basin in the town of Raleigh, North Carolina, and lived initially in a house 4 blocks west of here from age 0 to 6 weeks. I now live in Chapel Hill in the Cape Fear River Basin.
Thank you. And Ms. Monas?
I live in the Falls Lake and Neuse watershed, and we've got a little bit of land there in unincorporated Orange County and a little creek that we have protected in Orange County's riparian habitat program. So thanks to them for that great program. But I'm right on the edge of the Cape Fear, so sometimes when I go for a run, we joke that we kind of run across the watershed lines. Because I'm in the Falls watershed, I've served previously on the Falls Lake Walk. And I also have done a lot of work with agriculture in the eastern part of the state, and so know a lot about those watersheds as well. So thrilled to serve. Thank you.
Good. And we welcome our other commissioners who are sitting in today. Thank you for joining us. And as always, our council is here to help, as we certainly need. And I'd like to welcome our division director. I've invited her to sit with us, and in future meetings, she may have her second in command sit at our right, but it's a practice that I've used over the years, and it's very helpful to have them here at the table and ready to respond to any questions we may have on procedure or the department policy. So thank you, Linda Culpepper. Okay, we have 4 agenda items, and I've been told that I was made aware of the fact that the 3rd and 4th agenda items are reversed on the handouts that you have for today on your agenda. So if you'll please make a note that the 3rd agenda item will be the presentation on classifications by Ms. Kuntis, and the 4th one will be the swamp designation agenda item. So anything I forgot? Yes, okay, yes. As with Ms. Arata, I need to be reminded about my minutes. So we have minutes from our previous meeting. Are there any comments, changes, revisions to those? And if not, I'll entertain a motion.
I do have.
Yes.
At the very end of the meeting, just for clarification, says the draft September 11, 2019 water quality meeting minutes were prepared. Are these the July 10th meeting minutes or the meeting? If you look at the very end of the meeting minutes, that last sentence, I'm not sure whether it's referring to this meeting or to those minutes.
I think it said, Ms. Weaver, that should say either will be prepared by or they were, we should be referring to the July meeting.
Yes.
So thank you for catching that. I think that should be the July meeting. So with that one revision, are there any other changes to the meeting minutes? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve as amended.
I move we approve as amended.
Thank you, Ms. Commissioner Davis. A second, please? Second by Vice Chairman Harris. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any objections? Motion carries. Thank you very much for pointing that out. Our first agenda item is request approval of 2020 303D listing and delisting methodology. This is posted as an action item and presented by Pam Bean of the Modeling Branch. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Again, I'm Pam Bean with the Division of Water Resources Modeling and Assessment Branch, and I'm here today to, let me go down the slide, request approval to proceed to the EMC for approval of the proposed clarifications to the 2020 303D listing and delisting methodology. As a brief outline for my presentation today, I'll first review the statute, the history of the program, and abbreviated history, and then get into the 2020 methodology updates. (143B-282C) is the relevant statute that brings the EMC into the 303D process and was established in 1997. This basically means the EMC is responsible for establishing the methodology for 303D listing and delisting determinations. I should also mention that development of the methodology or the list itself is not a rulemaking process. In light of new members, I'd like to review some terminology that you will hear throughout the presentation. In the next few slides, I will review some of these in more detail. The 303D list refers to the section of the Clean Water Act where it was established, and is the list of impaired waters where a TMDL or alternative management action is needed. An impairment is parameter specific. So, for example, you may see a water listed for dissolved oxygen on the 303D list as an impairment, but could be meeting criteria for other parameters. So again, a TMDL is a total maximum daily load, and that establishes the maximum amount of a pollutant in a water body and sets limits on those sources, both point and non-point. An assessment unit, you also hear it referred to as an AU, is the spatial description of an assessed water. An excursion is an individual exceedance of a standard. So you'll have a data set and one monitored data point that's above the standard is called an excursion, whereas an exceedance or an exceedance rate is that number of excursions over the time period that's specified. Generally, that's expressed as a number or a percent. And then finally, there's the integrated report. And what that does is combines Clean Water Act sections 305B and 303D, and that's the list of all assessed waters, whether it's meeting criteria, data inconclusive, exceeding criteria, so on. Okay, so I'll get into some of those now in more detail. So the 303D list, that is the list of impaired waters. It is established by section 303D of the Clean Water Act. It does require that we have public review and comment for a minimum of 30 days, and it is due to EPA every even-numbered year on April 1st. EPA does have final approval authority for the 303D list. The 303D listing and delisting methodology, which is the document you have before you today for approval, and that establishes the decision-making process for determining whether a water should be included or removed from the 303D list. And removing a water is also called a delisting. The Clean Water Act requires we submit the methodology to EPA, but EPA is not required to approve it. However, if EPA does not agree with a listing or delisting decision, and that's usually based on the methodology, they can disapprove or partially approve the 303D list and can add waters to the list. And that happened in the 2014 and the 2016 cycles, most recently. You also hear reference to the integrated report. That is the list of all assessed waters and their assigned categories. And I'll review those categories on the next slide. There are 5 categories of assessments in the integrated report. Many of you saw this during our last during the 2018 cycle. We showed this slide a lot. The first 2 categories, 1 and 2, are where waters are meeting criteria, and that's that blue MC circle. The third category is for data inconclusive, that's the gray DI. And then 4 and 5 are where a water is exceeding criteria. Category 4, though, is for waters that do not need a TMDL because they already have one or some other management action is in place. Category 5, only Category 5, is the 303D list. And this, again, is for waters that need a TMDL or an equivalent management strategy. And again, the EMC's role here is determining the methodology that impacts decisions on Category 5. All right, so that's kind of the review of terminology. Now I'll get into some of the more assessment procedure type discussion. So starting with the data window, each 303D assessment is a 5-year data window, and it rolls forward 2 years each time. So for 2020, the data window is 2014 to 2018. New data years, and those are years that were not included or assessed on the previous list, are 2017 and 2018. I should also mention that if an assessment has no new data associated with it, the previous listing will just carry forward. These are the 5 different assessment procedures for 303D listing. The first is the one we talk about most of the time, and that holds true for today's presentation as well. This is the numerical criteria assessment, where we use a statistical method called the binomial method for numerical criteria assessment, and in most cases require 10% exceedance with 90% statistical confidence that the water is exceeding criteria in order for a water to be included on the 303D list. The binomial method was first used in 2014 in North Carolina. Prior to that, we just had a straight 10% exceedance rate. We also require a minimum of 10 samples for listing decisions. The other assessment procedures are related to basically the bugs in the fish, and that's the biological ratings that you'll see for benthic and fish community, pathogen criteria to assess as recreation standards, shellfish growing area assessments, which is by far the largest number of waters on our 303D list, and then fish advice and advisories where there's fish tissue data. There is a very long history associated with the 303D list, but I'm going to focus on the more recent history related to the 2018 list, where we really made some pretty big changes. The 2018 changes were in response to EPA objections that held up action and caused partial disapprovals in 2014 and 2016, and caused EPA to add waters to the list and got us off track for the biennial cycle. Remember, they're due April 1st of every even-numbered year. This is all related to the binomial method, which in 2014 and 2016 only applied to deciding whether to list a water, but did not consider confidence in meeting criteria for delisting decisions. As a result, we were delisting waters where there was very low statistical confidence that the water was actually meeting criteria. So 2018 was really my first list from start to finish, and our instructions from management after many, many conference calls with EPA, we even pulled some EMC members into those conference calls at the time to really understand what the problems really were. And so my marching orders were basically come up with a way to balance decision making while maintaining the integrity of the intent of the binomial method. And so basically, work out the kinks, but don't upend the apple cart. So the changes we made in 2018 actually impacted very few waters. It seemed like a lot, but there was really very few waters that got pulled into those changes. I think the total was was somewhere around 50 when you compare to about 16,000 assessments that the state typically does during an integrated report cycle. So, but even though it impacted few waters, what it really did is provided clarity to our process that had previously been missing, and it justified our decision making. Staff performed outreach to stakeholders during list development, more so than probably any other list, to make sure there was understanding about the changes and the impacts of those changes. So the changes that were primarily done in 2018 were we added an explicit delisting process, which had previously been missing. We added a process to evaluate small data sets, and we added processes to balance that statistical criteria for meeting and exceeding decisions. Good news. We submitted the 2018 303D list to EPA on April 2nd, 2019, 1 year and 1 day late. But because we had already reviewed the changes with EPA and kept them informed throughout the process and made sure that they understood why we made the changes we did and what the thought process was behind it, they were able to quickly turn around this approval, and they provided approval to us on May 22nd, 2019. This was the second fastest turnaround the state has ever received on a 303D list submittal, and it was the first unconditional approval the state has ever received. It was a really long process to get to that point, and we had, I think, 4 presentations to the EMC or Water Quality Committee throughout that time, because we just needed to make sure that what we intended was really happening. I have to give credit to Cam McNutt, our statistical guru who works with me in the modeling branch and is here today for your technical questions, and the EMC for bearing with us through those changes as we work through it. So moving on now to 2020, we didn't want to make too many changes given the success we had with 2018. Felt like we were finally getting on the right track there. So, but when we put the 2018 303D list out for public review, we also requested comments on the methodology itself and the integrated report, just due to the amount of stakeholder interest there was at the time. And I think it actually really helped us in responding to comments to have that kind of holistic look at the entire integrated report. Based on those comments that we received on the methodology, we have added some clarifying language to the 2020 methodology for your approval today to take to the EMC. The changes we are proposing is to first add a section on assessment unit delineation, address an unintended consequence for waters not previously listed with greater than 3 excursions in new data years, and I'll talk more about that. And we added a delisting process for the old total metals listings. Note that the first and third bullets have asterisks. These are not really a change, but are added to the 2020 methodology based on public comment to provide clarity to the process. I will note that we have already reviewed these changes with EPA, and we have not heard any concerns. All right, so now I'll review each of those changes in a little more detail. So back to that section on the assessment unit delineation. And I will note that in the attachment you have today, the methodology itself, I went through and highlighted where we made those major changes so that you could clearly see them. The comments we received about assessment unit delineation, however, were not related to waters on the 303D list. They really are in regards to a site-specific issue, namely Falls Lake, that still needs a solution, and we're working on that. But we felt it was appropriate to add this clarifying language for the public for our 303D process. The next few slides I'll go through it in a little more detail. This language, how we delineated assessment units, was previously located in our integrated report category assignment procedure, so it's not a new thing that we're just adding this time. An assessment unit it's the spatial extent of a water quality assessment. We use it for the 303D list, and it's basically just shows you For example, AU 9-23-14B is for Cedar Creek, but it's not all of Cedar Creek. It's Cedar Creek from State Route 1008 to the confluence with Crow Creek. So it really is just setting that spatial description for that water. What causes an AU to change? The way that we do this is the monitoring stations within an assessment unit are first assessed individually. If there are differences in the resulting assessment, and this is for cases where we have more than one monitoring station in an assessment unit, which is fairly common throughout the state. So if we get a difference in the assessment for two different stations, we'll go ahead and split it to show that there's a difference between these two areas. This can happen due to changes in water quality. Sometimes it happens because new stations have been added, and sometimes it's just due to methodology changes that have changed how assessment decisions are made. That third one, not so much anymore. This is applied statewide, and it has been the procedure consistently since 2004. We use this method for many reasons. It is, first of all, consistent with not to exceed standards. Quite a lot of our standards are written not greater than or not to exceed. They provide no temporal, spatial averaging component or anything like that. So this is really consistent with these not to exceed standards. It also adds transparency. It's very easy for someone to see why an assessment unit changed because the results of the two stations were different. It also avoids us having to make arbitrary decisions. And it avoids having to impair or even rate inconclusive larger areas than necessary. So we can really show where waters are meeting criteria and where there might be hot spots that if you address it now, maybe it won't become a larger problem down the road. So we really are trying to show on as small a scale as possible where there are issues with water quality standards. This was discussed in detail in our response to comments to the 2018 review. And as a result of those comments, we added the section to the methodology to explain that process and provide some context for it. And again, it improves transparency, and that's really what we want here. Okay. So for the next change, as part of that balancing of listing and delisting decisions, in 2018, we added a listing decision where if there was greater than 10% exceedance, but less than 90% statistical confidence in exceeding criteria, and there were greater than 3 excursions in new data years, the water would be listed on the 303D list. The unintended impact of this was that it could potentially penalize those who collect more frequent data. The greater than 3 works really well with our normal monitoring, monthly monitoring schedule, but if you're collecting more frequent data, this can really have an unintended consequence that we didn't think was not what we were wanting here. So we went ahead and to fix this, we have added that there needs to be 90% confidence in exceeding criteria in the new data years in addition to the more than 3 excursions in order to lead to a new listing. Again, this will not impact a lot of waters. We estimate maybe 10. And former committee members will remember these flowcharts fondly, I'm sure, from 2018. We spent a lot of time on these. I'm not going to go through them in great detail here, but the change we are making for 2020, and these are also on that last page of the document that you have before you, is that box right under that green arrow. So we've added that highlighted area in yellow that there needs to be 90% confidence in the exceedance. And so basically what this flow chart is showing here is these are waters. The green arrows are yes, red is no. So we have yes, greater than 10% exceedance, no, we don't have 90% confidence. It was not listed on the previous list, but we do have greater than 3 excursions in those new data years. So that was actually a pretty minor change. It will impact less waters than that process had in 2018, but I think it'll be helpful. As far as the third change we have added to the methodology, it's to include a delisting process for total metals. The state adopted new dissolved metal standards in 2015. That replaced the old total metal standards. So we collected dissolved data for about 30 stations in 2015 and 2016, and using that data, we were successfully able to delist 41 water body parameter combinations in 2018. But we did not have this delisting process explicitly laid out in the 2018 methodology, where you've got a new standard, new data, replacing an old standard. And so it led to some confusion among stakeholders who saw delistings that they were confused about. So we added language to the 2020 methodology that makes it clear that we will delist those old total metals when new data are available for assessment under the new standards. I should note, though, this is one area where we are still in disagreement with EPA over the assessment approach. EPA prefers a greater than one excursion in 3 years methodology for listing decisions, but we have significant concerns about that approach because we don't think it's appropriate, and again, penalizes those who collect more frequent data. And we're not alone in those concerns. In fact, I should note, Jeff Manning, our standards branch supervisor, is right now sitting in Washington, D.C., participating in a 2-day workshop that EPA has put together with experts from around the globe to talk about this. And so we hope to have resolution on this soon so that we can get back to our regular ambient monitoring for dissolved metals where appropriate. So I don't expect for 2020, we might have a couple of stations with some dissolved metals data for evaluation. And what we are finding is if there are 10 samples, it's pretty consistent in the decision making, whether you use our method or EPA's preferred method. So that 10 samples is pretty much the magic number there. But we're hoping to resolve this issue so that we can move forward. And this is just this language here is what was added to the methodology itself. I won't read through it. But it basically is just saying if we have new data, we're going to delist that old total metals listing. Okay, as far as the timeline goes, normally we would bring the methodology to Water Quality Committee for approval and then EMC the following day because we don't have the 30-day requirement here. But assuming we have approval today, we were asked to delay till November just to give you all time to process this and ask questions that you have about these changes. And so that's the plan. Assuming we have approval in November, we could begin assessment. That typically takes about 4 to 5 months. That's gathering third-party data, incorporating it with our data, the water sciences section out of the lab, pulling together all of that data to do the assessment. We would then most likely be able to get out for public comment March, April 2020. Obviously, we are not going to hit the clean water due date of April 1st, 2020. We were a year and 1 day late for we're playing catch up. 2014 took forever, 2016 took even longer, 2018 we got better, but we're still playing catch up to those delays that happened. So we're really trying to get back on track here. So we'll hopefully be able to report to you with an information item. Typically we do that at the end of the assessment once we have public comments and right before we're ready to submit to EPA for approval. And that's pretty much what I have for you today. Of course, we're recommending approval to proceed to the EMC for approval of the proposed clarifications to the 2020 303D listing and delisting methodology.
So just to make sure I understand, you're seeking approval today from the committee, but it would not be presented to the EMC until November?
Correct.
Okay. Are there any questions? I would welcome a motion to approve.
So moved, Madam Chair.
Mr. Gillespie, do I hear a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. McAdams. So we have a motion and a second to approve the methodology to go forward to the EMC for review and approval in November. Any further discussion?
I would just like to thank the staff for all the heavy lifting that occurred last time through, because I think it makes this a lot easier. So thank you very much.
No discussion. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our second agenda item is a request to proceed to the EMC with the 2019 Annual Environmental Review Commission, or ERC, report on basin-wide water management planning. Nora Deemer, basin-wide planning, presenting, and we heard her just earlier,
Yeah,
briefly.
hopefully slow down a bit here and actually get my words out this time. So, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here and to present our annual report. I am one of the senior planners in the Basin Planning branch. I currently cover the Neuse, the Tar Pamlico, the Cape Fear, and a part of the Chowan River Basin, as well as assist other planners that have nutrient-related issues in their basins. We currently have 6 planners, 4 of which are in the process of writing their first basin plans, and we are also adding 2 additional planners over the next few months. So, to begin, in North Carolina, basin planning is a watershed-based approach to managing water resources that considers the cumulative impacts of all activities across the basin. The Basin Plan consolidates data collected by water-related resource agencies and provides a single location to present water quality and water quantity-related issues. Basin plans are required every 10 years, but the process is continuous and involves several federal, state, and local agencies as well as stakeholders. It is important to note that the statute explicitly states that the basin-wide water resource management plan is not a rule. These are documents used to report on the current and past conditions and watershed activities and plan for the future with recommendations for preserving and protecting our water resources. We are also required to report annually to the ERC on several items that are assessed in the course of preparing or revising basin plans, and this is why I'm here today. But we felt that since we have so many new members that we would do a very, very brief 2-slide review of basin planning. And we are actually proposing to maybe do a lunch and learn in the future to give you more in-depth information of what basin-wide planning entails. Basin plans have always included information about water quality. When Session Law 2013-413 combined the former Division of Water Quality with the Division of Water Resources, we integrated all aspects of water resources with the goal of developing a comprehensive water resources management plan. And this is some of the information that actually goes into it. So you can see there's a broad range of things that goes in, from water quality information like the biological monitoring, looking at the fish and the bugs, our ambient monitoring programs, which do stream monitoring, and we do lake monitoring. We also use some information from Division of Marine Fisheries on their shellfish closures, from DHHS on their fish consumption advisories. And we also utilize a lot of the water supply planning and information looking at water supply and demand projections, the capacity use issues, stream flows. We incorporate permitting information. So we cover a lot of areas. So basin-wide planners utilize watershed characteristics along with water quality and water quantity data to understand the current conditions and how they have changed over time, as well as work with many stakeholders to understand these water bodies so we can include recommendations on how to preserve, protect, and enhance these systems. Basin planning process is essentially a continuous cycle. Each basin is unique in many ways. There are different concerns, resources, activities, and stakeholders in each of the basins. Each year, the basin plans are used to assist with grant writing. We produce an annual report which describes water resource issues that we have identified over the previous year, and again, that's why I'm here today. Every 2 years, the state updates the integrated report, which Pam was just talking about the process in which we do that, which includes the state's impaired waters. The report is based off a 5-year sliding window to capture the most recent data. Every 5 years, samples are collected to assess biological communities and assess lakes. Permits are also evaluated and renewed every 5 years. So throughout the process, special studies, management strategies, and needs are evaluated, and recommendation and actions are identified. Basin plans are required every 10 years, but the process is continuous. So as part of the basin-wide planning legislation, we are required to complete an annual report by November 1st of each year, which includes 7 required components. And I just broke those down to make it a little bit easier to digest. These include reporting on the progress on the development of hydrologic models, on the development and implementation of basin plans, on our involvement in public education and outreach, as well as to report on information regarding the concentrations of heavy metals and other pollutants in surface waters identified in the course of preparing or revising basin plans. We met with Dr. Myberg in the beginning of this year to review what would go into this year's annual report. It was agreed that we would limit the scope of the report to these 7 required components.
And I'll just add by way of comment that there was a certain amount of mission creep that had been going on with this report over the years, and people started loading all kind of things into it, which in the abstract sounds great, but in practice for the staff was creating a tremendous burden and making it less possible to do what they're actually mandated by statute to do. And so I agreed with the staff's judgment on this, that they need to focus on what they were required to do.
It was much appreciated. Thank you. So I will briefly review what we included in the 2019 report, which covers the time period of July 1, 2018 through June 30th, 2019. We reported on the progress in developing the new Watauga and the French Broad River Basin hydrologic models. And once these are completed, we will begin the development of the Yadkin PD and the lumber models. Table 1 in the report provides a summary of all basins with hydrologic models completed and in progress. The report also includes the stakeholders that are generally involved in the development of the models. We reported on the development of basin plans, which include the completion of the Watauga River Basin Plan, which was approved by the EMC in October of 2018. We also included a list of basin plans that are under development. This includes the Chowan and the White Oak River basins, which are well underway and will be presented to you in 2020. We are also continuing to work on the Cape Fear, the Neuse, the Pasquotank, and the Yadkin PD. We recognize we are behind in our plan updates, and we are in the process of reorganizing and prioritizing the information included in basin plans, as well as develop a timeline for completion. This information will be available on a table on the EMC webpage shortly. We report on the river basin specific activities for all 17 river basins. These included completed special studies, algal bloom information, and other areas of concerns and actions taken over the time period of this report. We reported on public involvement. Basin planners continually work with stakeholders as the basin plans are being developed to learn about local concerns and implementations that are underway by local watershed groups, local governments, and resource agencies, as well as many of our universities. Draft basin plans are released for public comment and are submitted to the EMC for review and approval. I also wanted to state that we have started working with the EMC on an Adopt a Basin program, where basin planners work with EMC member or members to act as liaison and advocates for our particular basin. Where this occurred over the last year, we included this activities in the annual report. And We will be working with Dr. Myberg and Ms. Derhake over the next few months to finalize basin assignments to those that are interested in participating.
Commissioner Deerhake has set an impossible standard for the rest of us, just a note for the record.
We also reported on our many public education and outreach opportunities. Planners and other division staff members have participated at numerous conferences, scientific advisory committees, as well as at different watershed group meetings, and within DWR for cross-training and education. We have also worked hard over the last several years to improve access to watershed-related information through tools like our online interactive maps, open data pages, as well as incorporating basin plans into the Story Map platform. These tools are continuously improving and will allow interested parties to have access to the most up-to-date information we have available and not to have to wait for a plan to be updated to understand the changes that are occurring in the watershed of their interest. Reporting on the concentrations of heavy metals and other pollutants in surface waters. The report reflects the approved 2018 integrated report, which is a requirement of the Clean Water Act. And again, Pam just covered that in a lot of detail. EPA approved the 2018 list in May of 2019, so the report reflects the final 2018 IR information. The biggest change identified was the reduction in total copper impairments. This was the result of assessing previously impaired areas with the new dissolved metals standards, which resulted in 28 listings being removed from the impaired waters list. We also updated specific sections, basin sections, with the results from special studies and other information identified in the course of preparing or revising basin plans. So the 2019 annual report fulfills the statute requirements as described in 143-215.8b, subsection D, and 143-355, subsection P. And so with that, we are requesting approval to send the 2019 annual report on the basin-wide water resource management plans to the EMC tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. And because this is a report and not a regulatory action, our 30-day waiver does not necessarily apply here, so we can carry it to the EMC the next day if it's the wish of the committee. So are there any questions? No questions. I will thank you and congratulate you again. I think it's really added a wonderful new dimension to add the water quantity side to these plans. And you said you'll be getting 2 additional staff to raise the number to 6 for the 17 basins.
So it'll be 8 total.
It'll be 8
Yes.
for the 17 basins.
Yes.
Well, I know that the department has had to carry a large load with these basins, and thank you for doing all you can to keep on schedule as best as possible. Yes, Dr. Myberg.
I'll just note that this really is a very good effort, and it is the one place where we try to bring together results from all these different programs that the department has going on. Even if we don't get to all of Commissioner Solomon's things about integrating groundwater, this would provide a basis for looking at taking a comprehensive look at the water resources, both quality and quantity in a particular basin. And it's a great framework for helping ordinary citizens as well as the commission understand some of the challenges each of these basins face. So thank you for doing this.
I think it would also be helpful to know any feedback that you received from the ERC's review, if you could plan to report that to us at some point.
I would be happy to. In the many years I've been here, I've never received any comments back from the ERC.
So. Okay, good.
I would also be interested to know what they think.
Yes. Do I have a motion to approve to take this to the EMC tomorrow?
I move approval.
Ms. Davis. Second? Second by Commissioner Gillespie. Okay, thank you. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, as I mentioned at the beginning of the agenda, we are reversing the order of items 3 and 4. So next, we'll have a presentation on North Carolina's surface water classifications. Ms. Kuntas from the classifications group. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Elizabeth Countess, and just wanted to present you with a quick overview of the state's surface water classification program. So with a quick introduction, I will then move into information about each of our surface water classifications. Let you know where you can find out more information about the regulations associated with those classifications, and then close with the steps involved in the reclassification process. So virtually all of the state's surface waters are classified, with the exception of treatment systems such as hog lagoons. And classifications represent the criteria and standards required by law for waters and their uses. Classifications also may change over time if a use has changed or is anticipated to change. There are primary classifications and supplemental classifications. For our tidal salt waters, we have 3 types of primary classifications: Class SC, Class B, and Class SA. The Class SC classification protects or provides the basic protection level for all of the state's surface tidal waters and protects for secondary recreation as well as aquatic life. Secondary recreation consists of activities that occur on an unorganized, incidental, or infrequent basis, like wading and boating. The Class SB classification protects for all the Class SC uses plus primary recreation. Primary recreation is defined by the state to include swimming, water skiing, and other activities that occur on an organized or a frequent basis. And then there's the Class A classification, which protects for all Class SC, and SB uses, as well as commercial shellfish harvesting. One example of a water with a SA classification in our state is the entirety of the intracoastal waterway. The Class SB and SC classifications regulations only cover a water body or a segment of a water body, which is also called a receiving stream. However, the Class SA regulations cover land and waters. In fact, those regulations apply to half-mile and draining to SA classified waters. For our fresh waters, we have Class C, Class B, and the water supply designations. So Class C provides our basic level of protection for all of the state's surface freshwaters, protecting for secondary recreation, aquatic life, wildlife, and also agriculture. Class B protects for all of the Class C uses plus primary recreation, and then there are the water supply classifications. The water supply classifications protect for all the Class C uses plus drinking, culinary, or food processing uses. The water supply 1, 2, 3, and 4 classifications are specifically for public water supplies. The remaining and last water supply 5 classification is for non-public water supplies located upstream and draining to water supply 4 waters, or former public water supplies, or they are waters used exclusively by industries for their employees only. Examples of nearby waters carrying both the Class B designation as well as the Water Supply 4 designation are Jordan Lake and Falls Lake. So the Class B, C, and Water Supply 5 regulations only cover a receiving stream, but the remaining primary classifications, that's the Water Supply 1 through 4, regulations cover both land and waters. Also, the water supply water quality standards apply to all water supply classified waters. It is the land management strategy that varies among the water supply classifications. And The regulations for these classes land management strategies apply to parameters such as type of dischargers, and by then I mean a generally permitted discharger versus an individually permitted discharger, as well as allowable density of new development. And these regulations apply to some or all of a water supply watershed, depending on the water supply classification and what part of the, what location of the watershed you're located in. So for instance, there are critical areas in our water supply 2s through 4s that are the land and areas in close proximity to an intake. So a half mile in draining to a riverine intake, or an intake within a reservoir or lake. And just know with reservoirs and lakes, we look at what we call a normal pool elevation. So then beyond that critical area within the water supply 2s and 3s, we look at the balance of the watershed. That is the rest of the watershed, the rest of the land and waters draining to a river and intake or normal pool elevation, for which regulations apply. With our water supply 4s, we have what's called a protected area. That's land and waters 10 miles and draining to an intake, or a river and intake, or 5 miles and draining to a normal pool elevation for an intake in a lake or reservoir. So the balance of the watershed protected area regulations are less restrictive than a critical areas regulations, with the exception of where the water supply 1 watersheds, where the same regulations apply throughout the entire watershed. So all of the state's waters have at least one primary classification, but they also may have one or more supplemental classifications. For instance, we have high quality waters. Those are waters that have a quality higher than state standards. Regulations associated with that designation apply 1 mile from and draining to the high quality waters. Some waters are what we call by definition HQW. For instance, SA waters, ORW waters, and water supply 1 and water supply 2 waters. So what that means is if a water has an SA designation, it automatically gets the HQW designation as well. Then we have our outstanding resource waters, which are waters with quality higher than state standards, as well as some exceptional significance. For instance, they're part of a state or national park or forest, or they have habitat for listed species. For this particular designation, the regulations apply on an entire watershed or drainage area basis. We also have trout waters. The net designation protects for natural trout propagation as well as stock trout survival, and a 25-foot buffer area applies to those designated waters. An example of a western North Carolina water that carries both the class trout and HQW designations in the French Broad River Basin is the North Fork Mills River. And there are 3 remaining supplemental classifications. Unique wetlands. Those are wetlands with exceptional significance, where regulations apply to a delineated wetland area. There's the swamp classification, which has naturally different characteristics than adjacent streams, such as pH, DO, velocities. And here regulations apply to a receding stream only. And lastly, nutrient-sensitive waters, where additional nutrient management has been deemed to be necessary, and those regulations apply in a watershed or river basin scale. Lastly, we have special management strategies, which aren't classifications in and of themselves, but they do provide water quality protections. And they come out of, or are the result of reviewing reclassification requests on a case-by-case basis. They're often defined by a symbol, like a pound symbol, plus symbol, and so forth in our river basin schedules, rules, and or in BIMs. And do know that the same symbol can vary in meaning from one basin to another. Examples of these special management strategies, for instance, apply to non-outstanding resource waters located adjacent to outstanding resource water designated waters. Those appear in 15A, NCAC 02B, 0225. We also have all the nutrient management strategies for Falls, Jordan, and Rambling Lakes, for the Tarpam, Neuse, and Catawba River basins, and they all have rules of their own. And then there are a few others, such as Thorpe Lake has a special management strategy in our 02B, 0224 rule. There's Goose Creek, has its own special management strategy rules in the 02B 600s. And then lastly, Lockwood's Folly, as well as a segment of Lower Cape Fear River, have their special management strategies in 0227. So if you want to dive more into the information within our rules, I would suggest you look at the first 3 sections of 15A and CAC 02B. The 0100 section gives some general information about implementing and assigning classifications. The 0200 is really where the meat is at. That's got separate sections for each of the classifications, providing standards and definitions and management plans for the classifications. And then the 0300s are what we call our basin rules. So a rule for each basin, for each of the 17 basins, to which the classification rules apply. There are a few classifications that haven't been implemented yet, but are defined in the rules. And that would include the SWL, which stands for saltwater wetlands, and just WL, which is for our freshwater wetlands. Up here on the desk next to the front door, I have provided you with a copy, if you'd like, of our guide to surface water classifications. It compares and contrasts the classifications. Do know that local governments can, and in many cases do, have stricter requirements for our water supply, watershed classified waters than the state requires. And if you want to know more about that matter, I guide you to, or suggest you talk to Paul Clark. He is our water supply watershed program coordinator within Demler. And he helps local governments implement regulations for new development associated with water supply classified waters. So lastly, I want to go through the steps in our reclassification process. It is a lengthy process, generally 2 years, sometimes longer. It is, as the slide suggests, a long road, lots of people involved. Sometimes we have detours along the way. It starts with a reclassification request that anyone can submit. That consists of a form and a map of the waters that the person submitting the request is interested in us looking at. We review that information just to make sure everything's complete. We do ask for water supplies reclassification requests, that we get those from local governments or any other entities that would be responsible for a water supply intake. Also, with water supply reclassification requests, we ask for some supplemental information, the status of any involved environmental document, and by that I mean an environmental assessment or environmental impact study. We also ask for resolutions, and by that I mean local government resolutions that indicate if a local government will implement the water supply regulations once the reclassification becomes effective for new development activities. And also we ask for the coordinates of the intake involved, if it's in a river, or the normal pool elevation of the reservoir if the intake is to be in a lake or reservoir. Then water quality studies generally required to determine if the waters meet the criteria that the proposed reclassification requires. If it does meet those criteria, then we will write a fiscal note or regulatory impact analysis. Just know that later terminology, regulatory impact analysis, is used when there's no fiscal monetary impact projected as a result of proposed rulemaking, which sometimes does happen with reclassifications. Then we'd come forward to this body, to the Water Quality Committee, to ask it to move the request, or for approval, to move the request forward to the Environmental Management Commission, where we would ask for permission to go out to public notice and hearing. And then once we hold the notice and hearings, we will come back to the EMC for a second time with a hearing officer report, also sometimes called a report of proceedings, that has all the pertinent information, including the comments, the water quality studies, and so forth on that proposed rulemaking to that point. And then I would go forward to Rules Review Commission for its approval, and then potentially on to the next legislative session. It will go to that next legislative session if 10 or more people formally object to the Rules Review Commission in writing, asking it to go forward to that session. And then hopefully, if it doesn't go forward to the legislative session, or it makes it out of session unscathed, it still has to go forward to EPA for their final approval. So for this year, for 2019, there are 2 reclassification processes going on. One is for the lower Cape Fear River, where it is proposed to have the swamp language removed. That's the next item. And then also, you've heard from Adrian Weaver regarding Sandy Bottoms wetlands, where the UWL designation is proposed to be added. We are also waiting for additional information on other projected requests as well as actual requests. And that information includes studies and evaluations for designations, including high-quality waters, outstanding resource waters, and water supplies. So here is a slide with my contact information. So do you have any questions about our state's classification program for surface waters? And I'm happy to entertain any questions you may have at this time.
Any questions for Ms. Countess? Mr. Gillespie?
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's not really a question, it's just a comment, and I'll be happy to make a motion if you'd like at some point, Madam Chair, to move ahead with this to the fullest. Don't need it. So just be a comment. This, when I heard Ms. Countess talking, I've had a lot of experience working with reclassifications, and I always have had a good experience with that. And she also talked about a little bit about the Watershed Protection Act, which some of you might get a kick out of what I'm going to say. But back in probably 91, maybe 92, when that rule first came up and legislation first came about, there was a big uprising across the state of people opposed to that. And me being the young activist I was right in the middle of it. And so when they formed a stakeholders group to work out the issues, lo and behold, I got appointed as a stakeholder, as a citizen. And during that stakeholder process, another interesting fact is that my good friend Bill Holman, who was head of the Sierra Club at the time, was also a stakeholder. And that's when I first got to meet Bill Holman. And so we worked through that process for weeks after weeks after weeks. There's probably 10 or 12 of us on the Watershed Protection Act. And we finally come to an agreement, and it finally passed, and everything was good. And I'd say to you that my main concern back then was worried about the regulations that come along with that, as far as the critical area that you talked about, as far as how it impacts counties and cities. And so that was my main concern. And so we felt like that we had it worked out. And as a result, the Watershed Protection Act is still in the original content that it was from back then. It's gone through the regulatory reform committees in the General Assembly for several times, and it's always been untouched. And just recently, about a year ago, my county actually had to use the act for what we was afraid of that might affect us. So 20 years later, we went through the process and did the classification on that, and it worked like a charm. So my kudos to the department for the way that they've handled that over the years, because I've been experienced to it firsthand, and of how good it is withheld all these years. So that speaks highly to working in a collaborative way as far as trying to get buy-in from everybody. Things like that, when you do that, things seem to survive over a period of time, and that's one of the things that has survived, and it's still a good program. So that'd just be my comments.
Thank you.
It's good to hear from someone who's had firsthand experience. Thanks. I'll just ask if you want, go ahead, Chairman Miles.
I just have one question. I was thinking about this in connection with your supplemental classifications and wondered, because I know I should know this, how are Pocosin wetlands classified?
So that, the UWL and WL that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, and there's a couple different layers to answer your question. So first of all, so those two particular classifications are in the books, but they have not been implemented at this point. However, we have had some UWL classifications come up.
Mm-hmm.
And so those, which Adrian has handled, have to have both a primary and supplemental classification. So those are ones that are the exception to the haven't been implemented yet statement that I made. So we do have several UWLs now, and those are actually we have those as in a map layer that folks look at, because you can't really describe them like you do a normal water body.
So as of right now, they aren't separately classified, but they're being considered for that use of that classification. Is that a fair?
Well, the other point I would bring up is that we do have 0230 and 0231 in our 02B rule. Which
I'm sorry, you
talks
lost
about
me
wetlands
there.
too.
And I
So,
figured if I got lost, I'm not the only one that got lost.
yeah, so they're not all brought out and classified in our schedules.
I see.
Some of them are, and some of them aren't.
Okay.
The UWLs are having, because those have been specifically asked for.
Okay.
Sorry, I wasn't.
So
Clear,
but
so-
then let me amend that to see if I heard it right, that in some cases, the issue has surfaced and there have been some classifications, but in other cases, there are similar wetlands where there's been no request and so no action to this point.
They haven't had a tag put on them.
Okay,
Of the,
all right,
yes.
thank you.
I would just take this opportunity to ask you to tell us a little bit about monitoring and the importance of monitoring data to support these classification decisions, either to maintain them or to reduce the category or to improve the category for protection, and the resources that the state does or does not have for a robust monitoring program.
I'll put this in the context of classification. So, 99% of the time when someone elects a water to be reclassified, we do not have the data that we need. So we have to have our field staff go out and provide that data for us.
And is that a long a period, is there a waiting list?
It does take a while, depending on when a request comes in. Data may be a few months forthcoming, or it may take 6 months for the data to be collected. Summertime is normally the busiest time, so if a request comes in May and folks are already scheduled, our field staff already heavily scheduled out to do all their ambient and other work during then, they may not get to the opportunity to be monitoring until September or October. Also, where we do have it, it is great to have. So there have been times when someone has submitted a request for reclassification, and that there might be data or data nearby that help to give me some indication of what does water quality look like in this area. For us, it is extremely important to have the field staff and their capabilities. Without it, like I said, most reclassifications would not occur.
I will say one thing I reported in my Southwestern North Carolina report was that the information I learned about a volunteer monitoring program, not as the primary driver, but as supporting information that's operated in the state of Georgia and how successful that has been. And maybe as time goes on, we can talk about the value or the issues associated with citizen science or volunteer monitoring to augment existing monitoring programs. Perhaps that's something the Science Museum would be interested in promoting. So it's something to think about. So, any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you. We will move on to item number 4 on our revised agenda, and that is requesting to proceed to the EMC for public notice with proposed removal of EPA disapproved swamp designation and portion of the management strategy from a section of the Cape Fear. And Ms. Countess is presenting that as well. Our counsel has stepped out for just a moment, but he'll be back in if there is something that we need to address regarding the petition. If you could please hold your questions until he returns. Thank you.
With the information I have given you, hopefully that will make this presentation a little bit more understandable. Again, my name is Elizabeth Countess, and I am here to ask the committee to approve moving forward the proposed removal of the swamp classification and a part of the management strategy for a portion of the lower Cape Fear River. So staff can then proceed to the full commission for permission to send the proposed rulemaking out to public.
Madam Chairman, it occurs to me that we didn't, Commissioner Gillespie had offered to make a motion about moving forward.
It does not require a
It does
motion.
not require, okay.
It was an information
So
item.
that does not need action, so.
Thank
I
you.
It just suddenly, I woke up and thought, oh yeah, he said something about
I
that.
appreciate
Never mind.
that. Thank you.
First, though, I would like to review the area to be affected by the proposed rulemaking and a small portion of the recent rulemaking for this water body.
Ms. Kunis?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. Mr. McAdams, if you speak into the microphone.
Thank you. Would you restate the intent of what we're undertaking here?
Certainly, certainly. So, at this point, I am here to ask the committee to approve moving forward to EMC the proposed removal of the swamp reclassification and a part of the management strategy for a portion of the lower Cape Fear River.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay. EPA has disapproved this?
That's right. And I will,
Okay.
I'll
All
be
right.
touching on that and coming up here in just a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So, so the proposed rulemaking affects the yellow highlighted portion of the Cape Fear River, shown on the screen, which travels from the upstream mouth of Toomers Creek to a line across the river between Snow's Cut and Lilliput Creek, where the river, or where the intracoastal waterway meets the river. This river segment flows along the border of Brunswick and New Hanover counties, and the majority of tributaries to this river segment are currently classified as swamp, as shown on the map. Wetlands mixed with developed lands, open waters, forest lands, and shrub and scrub lands exist directly adjacent to the proposed waters. In these waters, there are several tidal saltwater species, including the federally endangered short-nosed sturgeon and Atlantic sturgeon, and the Marine Fisheries Commission designation of PNA, or primary nursery area. In addition, during the rulemaking for the reclassification and management plan, there were 8 NPDES existing permitted wastewater discharges to these waters, and no known planned new NPDES wastewater dischargers. There was also 1 planned expansion of an existing NPDES wastewater that met the requirements of the classification and management plan, but had not yet been permitted. Since then, the 1 planned expansion did get permitted, and currently there are still 8 NPDES permitted wastewater dischargers and no known planned new NPDES wastewater discharges to these waters. Lastly, there aren't any plans for expansions of existing NPDES wastewater dischargers that require permitting at this point. Lastly, the river segment involved is impaired for water quality parameters, including DO and pH. just to review a little bit of the history involved here, in 2014, the Lower Cape Fear River program did request that this segment be reclassified from Class SC to Class SE swamp. The reclassification request stated, and I quote, "The DO standard of 5 milligrams per liter for the Lower Cape Fear River estuary is not appropriate since it has not achieved a significant portion of the time as a result of natural drainage from riverine wetlands and salt marshes." Then in 2017, the swamp classification and management plan became effective, providing a path forward for the dischargers and communities. And the swamp classification allows, if caused by natural conditions, pH of the subject waters to reach as low as 4.3 and the DO to be lower than 5 milligrams per liter. In addition, the water quality management plan associated with the swamp designation helped to implement the current permitting policy for the new wastewater dischargers and expansions of existing wastewater dischargers, with effluent limits for oxygen-consuming waste that are similar to the same limits for the high-quality waters designation. Then in 2018, EPA did disapprove of the swamp classification and part of the management strategy for this portion of the Lower Cape Fear River. As I noted during my earlier presentation, EPA requires that water quality standards, including classifications, that are adopted by states must be approved by EPA before they can be used under the Clean Water Act. North Carolina submits its standards and classifications for EPA approval to EPA's Region 4 Water Division. In 2019, earlier this year, a petition for rulemaking from the Cape Fear River Watch and Waterkeeper Alliance in care of the Southern Environmental Law Center was submitted to the division, and the petition requests that the EMC, and I quote, "remove the supplemental swamp classification from the Lower Cape Fear River." DWR staff analyzed that petition and concluded that the removal of the swamp designation from a section of the Lower Cape Fear River would impact the management strategy for that same section of the river that accompanied the swamp designation during the reclassification process for it. And then just a few months ago, in July, EMC granted the petition and approved the initiation of rulemaking to remove the EPA disapproved swamp designation and to remove the EPA disapproved portion of the management strategy. So in the next two slides, I'm going to show you the proposed language to be removed from the two roles involved in this matter. These changes are highlighted in yellow. All of Part T will be removed from 15A NCA CO2BO 311. And as a result, Part U below it will be relabeled as Part T. And then the SW for swamp, as well as Part C, will be removed from 2 of 15A NCO 2BO 227. As a result, the A through C will become A and B in the last sentence of the introductory text of 2. In addition, the Rules Review Commission has requested technical changes to these rules that are currently being addressed in the rule readoption process for these rules, such as adding commas and other grammatical changes and references. So those technical changes will be a part of that process, not this one. Also, a physical analysis for the swamp reclassification and management plan revealed no quantifiable cost or benefit, and thus removal of the reclassification and a part of the management plan does not result in a quantifiable cost or benefit. Lastly, the estimated effective date of this rulemaking is September 1st of next year. So with that, staff recommends that water quality approve moving forward this proposed rulemaking request to the EMC, from whom staff will seek permission to send proposed rulemaking out to public notice. And at this time, I'd be happy to address any questions that you might have associated with this proposed rulemaking.
I'm going to ask our counsel to offer any remarks he wants to make about the petition. Okay, and then followed by Commissioner Gillespie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think Ms. Countess did a good job recounting for you all where you're at in the process, because the commission did grant the petition at its last meeting. It's coming back before you now because that's the normal process, and after the petition is granted, the rules that are the subject of the petition follow the normal rulemaking process as any other rule would. So that's why it's coming back before the committee now, before it proceeds to the full commission at the next meeting.
Thank you. Commissioner Gillespie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'm going to show how slow I really am on this, because when I first looked at this agenda item, I thought to myself, wait a minute, what is going on here? We just did this. And then I thought, well, let me read it again. So I actually had to read it 3 times to figure out what we were doing here, because, like I said, I'm a little bit slow there. And so I finally figured it out, what we was doing in the process that we're in. And I know everybody's not as slow as me on that, but, you know, I had to take a minute to figure it out. And so, Madam Chair, if you would allow, at our July meeting, you know, she's reviewed a little bit of what's took place, but for my benefit, and just my benefit, could maybe Ms. Culpepper or somebody review the discussion that we had about this at our July meeting for my information, so I can make sure that I'm on the same page as where I need to be, if that would be allowed.
Yes, and also we could refer to our meeting minutes if we need to, that are for the EMC. It was voted on, Mr. Chairman Myberg, right at the July EMC meeting, right? That's correct. And we have not approved those meeting minutes, but we do have a draft that we can refer to if needed. Ms. Culpepper, are you comfortable recounting?
Commissioner Gillespie, I'm not sure if there's a specific aspect of that.
Well, the discussion that
Chairman
I
Myberg
had,
was,
you know, where I was considering making a motion at the last meeting. And so basically, you know, where we ended up at and why I didn't make the motion, if you could recount that as far as talking about the management strategy, which is going to have to be put in place and things like that. If you
Yeah,
you
but
need-
I'll be happy to speak to that a little bit. I think Commissioner Arata actually made the motion, so perhaps I should defer to her. But I will say that I remember very much that discussion, and the concern on the part of the commission generally was that the reclassification per se was kind of pro forma because EPA had disapproved it. So as a practical matter, it was not going to make any difference. But this was simply to bring state law back in conformance with the decision of the agency. But there was considerable concern on the part of the commission about the management strategy, what impact the reclassification would have on any impairments in the lower Cape Fear River. And there was a direction to the department or to the division to give some thought to the question of what changes, if any, would need to be made for existing management strategies in the river. Is that a fair?
That's exactly the way I remember it. And
Okay.
so,
And Commissioner Roddy, you probably should say something because there was a...
and that's the way I remember it, and which brings me to the point where I'm at now, Madam Chair. So after hearing that discussion, and just for some of the folks that are newly appointed here, we talked about it going back to 2014. It actually goes back, this issue goes way beyond that, all the way back to 98, when the original listing for low levels of dissolved oxygen was first put in place. And actually I found out in their last July meeting that it went back even years before that, but the department had never made any progress as far as looking at putting TMDL levels on this section of the river. And so it's made me think about what we done at our last meeting, and now here it is before us again, and it's got to go through back to the EMC again. And it's like, you know, I still am not completely satisfied with where we left off in July. And I've just had real trouble getting past that point. And the reason why is because of the management strategy that we know it's going to impact. They even say that it's going to impact the management strategy. So and they say there's no fiscal cost or no impact by removing this, that might be true, but there will be a fiscal impact with that management strategy, which makes me think, well, why should we approve anything right now that's going to lead to something else without knowing what the else is? And so why should we move this forward without knowing what those management strategies are? And the department said they would come back and tell us. Well, there's no rush on this. This was a citizen's petition, and there's no rush on us moving ahead at this time, even though some people might want to move ahead. But if you actually think way down the line where we're going to be in 2 years at the end of this rule, you'll be going before the General Assembly in the short session of 2022 probably. So, and then you'll be right back, like I said in July, right back where we are today. They're going to reject it again, just like they did in 17. They rejected it because we've gone through this already one time, and they rejected it, and we're heading right back down that same path for 2022 to being rejected again. And so why would we move something ahead that we know is destined to fail again unless the General Assembly changes hands and leadership over there? It's going to be rejected again. So why wouldn't we know what the management strategy is now and include that in these rules and move them along together in a way that there's consensus on this board? And by the General Assembly having that option, then they'll see that there is an alternative to what we're doing now by just removing it, and they would probably sign off on it. So if we had that management strategy in it, with it, and it moving together. And so that's what I've struggled with. And, we discussed this for a pretty good time in July, and I finally gave in and said, sure, we'll go ahead and do that and let the department bring it back. But after reading this and seeing it here again, what's rushing us from hearing from the department what that strategy is going to be before we move it forward? And we might not even want to include it, but we should hear that. And then why shouldn't we look at the data that's been collected over the past 50 years on this? Because their own report says that it could be caused by natural conditions. So if we've got 50 years worth of data sitting out there or beyond, why shouldn't this committee review the data again and see exactly if there is an issue? And I think the department's even unsure of that. Why shouldn't we review that data? And then why shouldn't we give the department time to submit to us what they see as their proposed recommendations on a management strategy is? And then if it took us a little bit longer than the path we're on now, then that would be good, because then it would be before the long session of the General Assembly, if it delayed it a little bit, which they've got plenty of time to debate and study, and the department could work with. And you'd end up with a rule sort of like the Watershed Protection Plan that finally, after 20 years of what we've done here, finally would stay in place instead of being rejected again, and in 2 years us dealing with this again. So that's why I struggle with, Madam Chair. And, maybe y'all can satisfy me again. Maybe Ms. Culpepper could satisfy me again today, but that's where I'm at, and I need help working through that because I think that we need to have the management strategy before us before we move it ahead again. And I think this committee needs to review all of the data and let the department prove to us that we need to move this by itself, or do we can't move it by itself until we get satisfied with that. Otherwise, we're setting ourselves up for failure again, and then we're setting ourselves up where the department implements things without being approved by the EMC or anybody. So those are my concerns, and if you could help me with that, Madam Chair,
Thank you,
I'd
Commissioner
appreciate it.
Gillespie, and I'll turn to council who has a remark to make.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Gillespie, if I understand your question correctly, it regards the efficacy or the advisability of the commission moving forward now with this set of rules, as opposed to waiting until you have the management strategies and that. So this might not be the most satisfactory answer, but it's the simplest one. The reason that you would want to the commission should be moving forward now is because after the commission granted the petition, it's required that the commission initiate rulemaking for the rules as proposed. So there's no real clear guidance on what initiate rulemaking means, but what the courts have said is it means that it goes through the adoption process through all the stages. If there was a fiscal note, this one doesn't require one, but if there's a fiscal note, you have to have a fiscal note before you can move forward to publishing your notice of text in the register. Well, that's not an issue here, so the next logical step is to move forward with publishing the notice of text. Now, the one thing I'll remind you and all of the commissioners about is at the end of this process, you initiate the rulemaking process, you go through the public comment process, you publish the notice of text, get the public comments. It does not require that the commission actually adopt the rule just to move forward with the rulemaking process. So, so it's my view, me personally speaking, that the law would require the commission to move forward with publishing the notice of text, absent some other special conditions or circumstances not applicable here, move forward with publishing the notice of text because that's what's required in the rulemaking process. Now, if at the end of this process, after receiving the public comment, the commission decides that it is not advisable to adopt these rules at this time, and it is better to wait until there's more, to adopt this, or to take a holistic approach, which is what you were suggesting at the last meeting, and including soliciting the EPA's help, as they said in their memorandum rejecting the classification. But that is a question separate from and can be answered apart from the question now, which is moving this forward because it's part of the petition process as opposed to just your general rulemaking and policy decisions.
Madam Chair.
May I ask one clarification? So the meaning of initiate rulemaking on a time scale, does that, how soon does the initiation begin?
There is no guidance from the court, but based on your staff moving forward with it, it can begin now.
And does initiating rulemaking mean publishing a draft or a proposed rule, or can it mean publishing a concept? What does that scope?
Depending on the circumstance, it may not even get that far. Initiate rulemaking is undefined and there's not much guidance. I know of another situation where a fiscal note was required as part of a petition for rulemaking, and the fiscal note was not certified. The Office of State Budget Management would not certify or approve the fiscal note, so the commission at issue in that petition wasn't even able to get to publishing the notice of text because they had to have a fiscal note in order to do that. But because they couldn't get one, they couldn't get that far.
Okay.
So,
Mr. Commissioner Gillespie.
So amazingly, I understand what you say, and that really helps me a lot. Which brings me to going back to July. With that understanding now, I probably shouldn't have gave in so easy in July.
Wait, that was easy.
That was easy. So I probably shouldn't have gave in so easy in July, because now we're on this path. But it also makes me think that we could, because the department, not my good friend Ms. Culpepper here, who I love dearly, not taking anything from her, but they might never give us a management strategy, or it might be 6 months from now, or who knows when it'll be. Like I said, Commissioner or Chairman Meinberg, if I was the chairman, we'd have it before we'd been doing this. If I was the chair, we'd definitely have the management plan before we'd ever went to July, but that's another story. So I could still make the motion now, and before I did, you could deny it or grant it, and I'd let you know, but I could still make the motion that we should do the management strategy plan along with this set of rules. We could add that to it and run them both together and do like I wanted to do originally. And what that motion would be, I'm not making it, but just to remind everybody, and Mr. Chairman Meinberg will remember it because he helped add a word or two to it, trying to find compromise last time. And so I've got it as we thought we was going to do it last time, and it would be a motion to develop a a site-specific criteria as appropriate, an appropriate water quality management plan, along with this declassification. And maybe the general counsel could state if that would be allowed and what that would look like, because I think that would satisfy everything, and we wouldn't be back here, because nobody still ain't told me we ain't gonna be back here in 2 years doing the same thing, with still nothing done, which is what's happened, is nothing has been done. So maybe I could hear from council whether or not that would.
Along the way to council, may we ask Director Culpepper if she'd like to make any remarks? So we haven't had a chance to hear from her. I'm sorry, yes, and followed by Commissioner Arata.
Commissioner Gillespie, I agree. We do need to work on the management plan. I think there's been work prior to the petition where there's been some discussions on some ideas regarding that management plan or strategy, and some additional research that would be beneficial to us in establishing that management plan. I'm interested in your feedback on the thoughts moving forward, how you would like to implement that. But I think we're open to research and some additional dialogue on what that management plan needs to be, whether that's through the rulemaking process or whether that's prior to initiating a formal rulemaking by publishing a draft set of rules.
Which could be part of this motion today, and move it forward just like what you said.
Repeat again for all of us exactly how you're hearing her say that, and to make sure.
So what she is saying is that the management plan, she's open to discussion on that and wants to do that, and the department needs to make progress on that. And so one option is what I just heard her say, is that the motion that I would make could be included in this in order for them to do that. Now, whether or not they want to do that or not, it's a different story. I can't answer that. But
So you're saying your motion could include begin drafting the management plan. Begin drafting the management plan.
you know, and Madam Chair, one last thing, if we could see the data, you know, there's nothing pushing us to do that this meeting. Maybe at our next meeting, if they could provide us the data that they have on this so that we can review that at our next committee meeting. And then with that motion being in place, if it's worthy to move forward, then I think you'd have unanimous vote in here on moving ahead and even in the full EMC. So that's sort of my thinking.
All right, thank you. Now Commissioner Arata.
Yes, so since I'm not on this committee, I'll keep this about to 90 seconds if I can. Just to recap what happened last time, there were three moving pieces. One was SCLC's petition for rulemaking, which got rid of legally irrelevant language at this point that still remains in the administrative code. There was a complementary recommendation from the Division of Water Resources that went along with that rulemaking, and then there was Commissioner Gillespie's recommendation that this water management plan for the lower Cape Fear be adopted together. And so my rationale for moving in two pieces was that, one, the SELC rulemaking petition, in my mind, equates to a technical correction, that this language is no longer good, so there was no reason to tie it to a much longer undertaking that would be that water management plan, but that it was important to go ahead and recommend or request that the division come back to us, maybe not next week, probably not at the next meeting, but come back to us to actually take action on that. Whether it goes to the General Assembly, I suppose we can't all control that, but that, in my mind, is not a driving force behind going ahead and moving forward on the first piece.
One follow-up to that.
Gillespie and then Ms. Modest after. Go ahead.
Thank you. And that was my driving force, is because it'd be rejected again. And I didn't want to see that happen. So that was my driving force for trying to solve the issue now, so that didn't happen again.
Commissioner Modest.
I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to what the normal sequencing would be in this kind of situation. I'm having trouble comparing. I completely understand the desire to understand the implications of the change you're making as you make the change. But what would the normal process be like, and how long would it take to develop the management plan?
Yeah, good questions. And I appreciate the focus back on a decision could be made regarding working with the EPA disapproval, and that's what we were trying to address as well, is that EPA disapproval to get the rules back where they were to address that issue. On the management plan, it's my understanding from staff, I mean, they spent years developing the plan that went into the rulemaking that we're now working with. So I don't believe this is a one or two session activity. I think there's some research we were trying to tap into from the University of UNCW, Wilmington, looking at the natural conditions of the area. We've added some additional monitoring stations to look at other contributions, including ag contributions. So there is some data that's coming in now. I'm not sure that we have good standing that we could bring this to you, say, in November or in January and have a final product, that might be satisfactory to what our Commissioner Gillespie is discussing. So you have options on how to go about this if you want to do a narrow rulemaking, or how robust do you want this to be?
Chairman Myburn.
I have a thought on this, because I find myself in agreement both with Commissioner Arata and with Commissioner Gillespie that I also saw this action per se as pretty strictly ministerial, since it is of legal effect now anyway, and is simply conforming state law to federal law. That said, in some ways, the department has initiated rulemaking by bringing this up for consideration and discussion here. So that, I don't know if it's that precise, but that seems like you got started on something. I also am in sympathy with Commissioner Gillespie about that. I think that part of the reason it moved forward is because there was general agreement on the part of the commission that they'd like to have a sense of, okay, when we move this back to the original classification, what implication is that going to have for upstream dischargers? Now, there's a level of precision question in what constitutes a management strategy or a management plan that I think we ought to bear in mind. I think it is possible for the division to come back to the committee with a little bit of an idea of, here's what the situation is in the Lower Cape Fear, here's what some of the potential issues are, and here's how some of them might be addressed, without having to necessarily figure out what all the discharge limits are going to be for all the discharges that are north of the impairment points on the Cape Fear River. And I don't think that's what Commissioner Gillespie is asking for. I think more of what he's asking for is what's the department's strategy overall for helping this particular segment of the river attain the water quality standards that apply to it. And that's what I hear, and I think that's a reasonable thing. And the progress on doing this particular change to the state rules would not be particularly adversely affected if we put this off to give the department the division a little bit of a chance to think through and come back and discuss that in connection with a motion to move forward with this action. I want to ask Commissioner Gillespie, is that sort of what you had in mind?
Yes, it is. I'd be completely happy with that at our next meeting if they could do that. And then, that would lead us to what, looking at the data, whether it's necessary, what's necessary as far as their management plan, and then there would be a fiscal note. There could possibly be a fiscal note that would be attached to it then at that time. So just whatever and that's what concerns me about moving ahead without them going together at one time.
So anyway, so that was kind of my sense of things, and my biggest challenge with Commissioner Gillespie's early proposed motion back at the July meeting was not so much with the notion that that it'd be useful to have the division say a little bit about what kind of overall strategy would be important. It would be that the motion as it was framed would sort of have mandated the development of a site-specific criteria, which was not what I think that Commissioner Gillespie had intended when he put the motion together. That certainly would be one possible element of a strategy, but I wouldn't want to dictate to the division or the department that that's what you had to do.
May I turn to counsel one more time, and also as he prepares to make remarks, remind us again about the date of September 2020 that you mentioned. Did you mention a September 2020 deadline of effective? No,
I don't
okay.
believe I did.
All right, never mind.
If I did, I'm sure I had a good point at the time. Now,
Okay, well, then your remarks, please.
what I want to remind the committee of now is we're really talking about two different things, okay? The reason you're considering moving forward these rules is because that's what your obligation is when the commission granted the petition for rulemaking. It's moving the rules forward. It is not, Commissioner Gillespie, respectfully, it's not that you gave up. It's simply that the commission moved forward in granting the petition, and almost in a ministerial act, because the rules come through the committee before they go through the commission, they're stopping here first. But the commission's already said, yes, we want to move forward with publishing these rules. It is not, I want to be clear on this, it is not that the EMC is required at the end of the process to adopt the rules, and if it is, in your opinion, not advisable for the commission to ultimately adopt those rules or take final action to adopt the rules as proposed by the petition, there is no more petition anymore. Once the petition got granted, it's just moving right along. We just have to move forward with those rules as proposed. If at the end of the process, your opinion is that the commission should not move forward in taking final action to adopt the rules without this additional information to go along with it, then it is certainly your prerogative to vote that way. But the committee does have fully formed rules before it now, which is taking action on because of the sequence in the process, or where we're at in the process, as opposed to rules, speculative rules, that might accompany them at some other point to take the broader approach. But those two things, as I see it, and what I would advise the committee is, those two things really are separate and can be done separately.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Gillespie.
And I would agree, but I think, in my opinion, they would never be rejected at that point if we went all the way through that. So I think, even though it could happen, it'll never happen. It'll never happen, and here we'll be moving that ahead without knowing the management strategy plan, and knowing the impact on it, and I just don't see that as a way to do it. I mean, you got an option of doing it either way, and I don't see it without knowing more. Now, like Chairman Meinberg said, maybe at our next meeting, they could give us some of the ideals, and I hear what she's saying, that they've got stuff in the works and at UNC Wilmington, but all that could happen in a rulemaking process, because you're talking 14, 18 months probably for that process, so it could very well be done by then, and then you can always amend it if you need to later on. But, I see us either moving ahead with the amendment to do them both jointly, or come back in 2 months and see what some of their ideals are, and look at some of the data that's been collected to know whether or not we should even move it ahead. That's
Director
my
Culpepper,
position.
did you want to say something?
Thank you. I just say my knowledge of the process before was a pretty robust stakeholder process, and one point could be, Commissioner Gillespie, if the rules were moving forward as recommended, including directive that there's an enhanced stakeholder process in the rulemaking effort to help design the management plan further, that you could have that directive within the rulemaking to move it forward, so we're handling the EPA denials, but at the same time endorsing and engaging in that stakeholder process.
And if I may, Madam Chair.
Yes, sir.
That is a very good compromise. And I hear you loud and clear. And, I'd like to know what some of the other members, that, if there are any others that feel like I do, how they feel about it. Because there it is, that I'm compromising again my position, which I'm all about that. But I think the rule's still going to be rejected, though, even with that stakeholder meeting, and there you are again. So,
Ms. Countess, did you want to?
I just wanted to add one clarification. So, during the original rulemaking process, a bill did get introduced over at the legislature, but it did not survive. I just want to make sure when you use the word they rejected that, okay, so there's,
Right.
EPA rejected it once it had gone through legislature, it had come out unscathed. We then submitted to EPA. So legislature didn't have a successful bill to stop the reclassification. And that is why it got to EPA.
And if I may, Madam Chair.
Yes, sir.
The reason they didn't act is because they didn't like it. And so the rules over there are if you don't act on it, it dies. So they wanted the status quo left in place, and that's why they didn't act.
So if I can summarize, I'm hearing maybe 2 to 3 different options. One is proceed with the vote as it's recommended by the staff today and as supported by our council. A second is to take the approach of waiting for the management strategy before acting, but then we would not qualify as, quote, initiating rulemaking, unquote. And then perhaps a third, okay, well, you can tell me about that. And then the third would be perhaps proceeding to the EMC with the reclassification contingent upon staff providing at least an early indication of what their strategy would be.
Early robust stakeholder process. Madam Chair, I think that's correct, except they would, what Ms. Culpepper said is they would provide a robust stakeholder meeting to look at the management strategy. So that's option 3. Option 2, if we didn't act, doesn't mean that we stopped the rulemaking process. There's no time limit on when we have to act to move this ahead. And so, like Chairman Myberg said, we could have another meeting where they bring forth the data and their thoughts on that process prior to moving it ahead in January or November meeting.
Okay. So either act on the reclassification alone, decide not to act on it today, or to act upon it with a condition of a robust stakeholder process design being brought to us at the next meeting. Yes, Dr. Lazore.
And I'm not on the committee, but just wanted to ask a question for the option B that you outlined. I mean, is 8 weeks fair to staff to come up with that information, which is really 6 weeks in the time that they would need to post it for the next committee? Like, I just worry that if it's as complicated as it's said, that would be too short a time and it could further get lost in limbo. But again, I'm not on the
Chairman
committee.
Myberg, you
And,
want
and that was my point in trying to clarify that is people are using the same word management strategy or managing plan, and I think they're meaning different things with it. And what I understood Commissioner Gillespie to be looking for is not, like I said, the details of exactly what rule is going to apply to which source and this kind of thing, but rather just in general, you have an impairment that's got a number of different potential reasons for it. And while we probably don't now have all the data that's going to be known to do what I would call a full management plan, if you will, still it would be useful, I think, for context for the members of the committee, of this committee, to hear what the general, because many of us are not as familiar as some who may have been involved in previous discussions matter for a prior commission, to sort of see what the context is, how some of the potential stakeholders are affected, and without having done a full stakeholder process, because I think that's going to take longer, at least I have some context for what it is that's going to occur as a consequence of moving forward with this particular action. And I think the struggle that some of the members of the committee are having right now is that some of us have viewed it through the lens of, oh, it's just a ministerial change, and others have viewed it through the lens of, oh my goodness, this is going to be the end of the world as we know it. And it's probably not either. The ministerial change, I think, is right as a matter of form, but I think it might help the committee feel better about it if there was a little more context than we have now, because not everybody was around when the previous action was taken.
Mr. Gillespie, and then Ms. Moniz.
That's fair, and since the chairman is a member of all committees, I would welcome a motion, if I was the chair, to that effect, that the department comes back in 2 months with that overview, and then that'd give all the members time to look at it and have more thought into it.
Commissioner Moniz.
Yeah, I still have another question. And I like the idea of getting an overview, basically of what we know now, not requiring additional research, but here's a summary of the state of things as you're aware of them. But I'm still not completely clear on what the request is, what this, precise step would be today, and whether we have to hold back on this today's step, or whether that request to learn more can be part of the process moving forward.
I think we're talking about it being a combined, so a motion today to proceed or initiate rulemaking with the condition that the department would bring, or the division would bring back to us at our November meeting their concept or their initial plan for a strategy.
So it's not any specific language, it's just we're approving, get going.
Is
that accurate?
Do I hear, am I interpreting that correctly from Mr. Gillespie, for example?
Madam Chair, I really wasn't planning on going that far,
Oh.
and I don't think Chairman Myberg wanted to go that far, actually, with the way you stated it.
Okay, well, I
But
welcome someone.
I would take it if we'll get a unanimous vote.
Well,
I'll entertain a motion.
I will be happy to make a motion,
Okay.
but would be happy to entertain friendly amendments if I don't get it right, which is that I would move that I guess I can do as a member of the committee, is that correct?
Because you're a member of the body, you have all the privileges and
thank you.
duties of a member.
I move that we table this action until the next Water Quality Committee meeting, and that in the meantime, we ask the division to brief the Water Quality Committee at its next meeting on the general context of actions that might occur in the Lower Cape Fear watershed in fulfillment of meeting the new water quality standards.
Madam Chair, may I interject?
Yes.
If the chairman wouldn't mind,
Chairman does not mind.
Instead of using table, maybe perhaps defer.
Thank you. I accept that as a friendly amendment.
I am not a member of the body. I cannot make such motions.
Defer is good.
Yeah.
And Madam Chair,
Yes,
if
sir.
the chairman would include a review on the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years worth of data in that, I would second that motion.
The chairman would certainly support review of all available data. But I don't think you're asking for collection of new data. Linda just looked like she had seen a
Yes,
ghost.
Ms. Culpepper.
Thank you. Just for point of clarification, well, do you need to ask a clarifying question?
I was just going to add that on October 10th, there is a review of the modeling data that is a informational session that is going to be provided, and I mean, you all are more than welcome to.
That'd be great.
Attend that.
Thank you. Absolutely. We will make sure we get it out to all the members. Clarifying the motion, are you asking us to provide that context to what would happen if the rule that was presented today were to move forward in terms of now we're deleting that part of the management strategy, what that impact is? Or are you asking us to give a broader context of what is happening in that area and ideas on if we could have a clean slate, where would we go with a management strategy?
It was more along the lines of the latter.
Okay.
So I'm not quite sure how to state that in form as an amendment to the motion, but the motion as I would like to make it is that we defer action on this item until the next Water Quality Committee meeting. And in the meantime, we ask the division to come back to the Water Quality Committee at our next meeting with a discussion of the context and possible strategies for addressing the impairment in that stream segment. Is that fair?
And using as much data as available. Okay, so we have a motion on the floor. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second from Mr. Gillespie. Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We will have it on our November agenda. And that is the last agenda item that we have. We thank the next committee for their time that we borrowed. And I will just say briefly that as we continue on with this committee, I have asked Adrian Weaver, who's been a tremendous help in these early months, to help us put together a longer-term calendar of our past and future anticipated regulatory actions for the committee, so we'll have a sense of what's coming out in the future. And I would like us to eventually, in the next few meetings, to begin a thought process about a prioritization or an issues. Let me hear your issues that you're interested in having brought to the committee to discuss. I'd like us to go through that exercise. I think it would be helpful to staff too in their long-term planning. So with that, we will adjourn the meeting with the understanding that we'll be meeting again in November. Thank you. You're welcome.